Good morning. My name is Stephanie Erdis, and I am MCASA's Associate Director. I'm very excited to be here this morning and to kind of kick off this sexual assault victim advocate training. We are going to jump right into some of the most important parts of being an advocate. And this training is on day one on purpose because you will then, it's an overview that you will then fill in other parts of this training with some of the information you're getting later in the week. So, for example, we're going to talk a little bit about hospital advocacy, but tomorrow you're going to have a whole session on the sexual assault response team. So hopefully today will give you an overview, and then as you go throughout the training, you'll get more information to kind of fill that out. So as we get started, the first way we really like to start this training off and this series off is with a breathing exercise. So it kind of helps bring us all together and focus our attention on this topic. This topic and the topics throughout the training they're hard topics, and this exercise can help prepare us for the next hour or so of learning. We'll be here for about 90 minutes, and help prepare us for the next 2 weeks together. So I invite you to sit or stand up straight, whichever feels comfortable to you. Feel your feet on the ground and your body, if you're sitting down, supported by the chair you're in. And you can relax your gaze. If it's comfortable to close your eyes, you're welcome to do that. And start to release the tension from your head and your neck and your shoulders, and feel that tension kind of release all the way down your body. And then I invite you to bring your attention to your inhales and your exhales. Not forcing air in and out of your lungs, just breathing and trying to bring that breath into balance so that your inhales are the same amount of time as your exhales. And relax into the rhythm of your breath, trying to let some of the thoughts of the morning go. It's Monday morning. Maybe you had a stressful start to the week. Let's try to leave all of that behind as we begin this exercise. We're going to take one deep breath together to the count of 4. So to begin, I invite everyone to exhale all the air in their lungs, and then begin the inhale, filling their lungs to the count of 2, 3, 4. Pausing, holding the air in your lungs, and now exhaling, emptying your lungs completely to the count of 2, 3, 4. Take a few more deep breaths like this one at your own pace, at your own count, whatever feels comfortable for you. Just trying to keep that deep inhale and that deep exhale even. And while you take some of these breaths, we want to take this time to acknowledge the survivors that are in our training today and the survivors we help as advocates. We also want to acknowledge the impact interpersonal violence has on all of us. And with that, we want to commit to a gentle and honest conversation and dialogue as we learn together. Some of the content in this presentation and throughout this series may be triggering to you or cause strong emotional reactions. We invite you to take care of yourself during this time and to come back to this breathing exercise if it serves you. Allow your breathing to return to normal with just a gentle inhale and exhale if you haven't already. And enjoy just another moment here. And when you're ready, come out of this exercise by beginning to move your body a little bit, maybe wiggling your fingers and toes, shaking your head back and forth, shrugging your shoulders. And maybe doing one big stretch with your arms overhead. And then bringing your focus and attention back to us as we begin our training. If you're standing, you can sit down. And just bringing our focus to this training. So as you're coming out of that exercise, I want to review quickly our training objectives. So this is what you're going to be learning today. Alyssa's going to take you through defining and reviewing the crisis intervention process and discussing the importance of a trauma-informed approach to crisis intervention. I'll introduce some best practices for managing difficult situations, and then we'll build and practice crisis intervention skills together. This training is really heavily presentation for Alyssa and I, but we do invite you to use the chat, and there are some questions we'll ask you throughout the training, so we invite you to participate in that. We'll also have some scenarios at the end that we want you to participate in and help us kind of learn together the best way to approach some of those serious situations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to begin talking about crisis intervention.
Thank you. So what is a crisis? A crisis is an acute emotional upset arising from developmental, situational, or social sources and resulting in a temporary inability to cope by means of one's usual problem-solving devices. So let's break this down a little bit more. Developmental crises happen over the course of our lifespan. These are things that are normal. They can be things that are not necessarily unpredictable or shocking. They're common among all humans. They could be things like retirement. They could be things like you're moving or you're accepting a new job. Some of these, they sound like they could be happy. They probably won't come to mind when you first think of what is a crisis, but some of these could also temporarily overload our nervous systems because of putting us in a state where this stress, where we're unable to cope by our normal means of coping. So that's one type of crisis. Then we have our situational crises. And these are things that you typically would think about when you hear the word crisis. These things are unanticipated events that occur at random. They're often sudden and shocking or catastrophic. So these are things like sexual assault. This could be a robbery, sudden death of a loved one, a diagnosis of a terminal disease. And lastly, we have the sociocultural crises. And these occur when situations or events arise out of cultural values and social structures and are directly related to gender, race, age, class, and sexual orientation. For example, seeing a massive increase in hotline calls and overall services for survivors during the resurgence of the Me Too movement caused a collective trauma and crisis for survivors. Sociocultural crises can also inform situational crises. For example, if someone experiences a crisis because of a sociocultural event, and then they also experience a situational crisis, such as a sexual assault, that situational crisis could put the person into a situation where they're unable to cope by their usual problem-solving devices or coping mechanisms because of that compounded trauma of the multiple crises that they've experienced. Next slide. So what is crisis intervention, now that we've established what a crisis is? Crisis intervention is when an advocate identifies, assesses, and intervenes with an individual experiencing a crisis. It is an immediate and short-term care that assists an individual in restoring equilibrium to their biopsychosocial functioning and works to help them restore balance and reduce the effects of the crisis in their life. So basically, what you're trying to do is you're providing this immediate and short-term care to someone right after they've experienced the crisis or after they have come to you where they have experienced this situation that they're unable to cope by their normal means of coping. And the skills that you build with them in crisis intervention are things that they can use throughout their life, whether or not they are in immediate crisis or they're experiencing stress where their nervous system is overloaded later. So these skills you're basically building this toolbox with them. in crisis intervention. Next slide. So over the next couple of slides, we're going to go into what a trauma-informed approach looks like. So a trauma-informed approach is based on the recognition that many behaviors and responses, often seen as symptoms expressed by survivors and consumers, are directly related to traumatic experiences that often cause mental health, substance abuse, and physical health concerns. So this basically means that the symptoms or the behaviors that a survivor may be expressing to you stem from that trauma that they've experienced. Now, any trauma-informed approach or trauma-informed protocols or systems that you are a part of or that you use will have the 4 main components that you see in these boxes on the slides. So you realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand potential paths for recovery. You're recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, staff, and others involved with the system. You're responding by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And you're seeking to actively resist creating a re-traumatizing environment. So you want to create a safe space that's physically safe and emotionally safe to prevent that re-traumatization. Next slide. So instead of giving you a set of like practices or procedures or steps of what is a trauma-informed approach, instead what we do is give you these 6 guidelines that you see bulleted here. So let's go into the first one, safety. So this is asking, is the thing that you're doing or the thing that you're working with the survivor on creating a safe physical and emotional space for the survivor? How can you promote safety for the survivor? Are there ongoing safety concerns that need to be addressed? Or are there immediate safety concerns that need to be addressed? With trust and transparency, how can you build trust with the survivor? How can you minimize the likelihood of re-traumatization? How can you provide accurate information on the next steps and options available to the survivor? And what can you do to ensure that the survivor understands that these options are available to them? How can you help the survivor understand what's currently happening and what will happen next, and that they have a decision, they have a choice, they can make that decision for themselves of what they want to happen next? With peer support, how are you showing that you're working with the survivor and not for someone else? How are you demonstrating that this is a collaboration, partnership? How are you ensuring that the survivor knows you're not trying to influence their decisions, but you're just trying to show them what options are available? Are you connecting the survivor with resources that they are most interested in, or resources or referrals that they say they want? With empowerment, voice, and choice, is this a positive interaction between you and the survivor? Are you normalizing and validating the survivor's experiences so that they feel empowered to make the decisions that are best for themselves? Are you restoring the survivor's sense of control in the situation? Are you relying on the survivor's voice and choice to lead the next steps? And if the survivor isn't ready to lead the next steps, are you supporting them so that way they can feel that sense of control again, so they can lead in the time coming? And lastly, cultural and historical relevance. So are we as advocates recognizing the historical and cultural trauma that survivors may be experiencing? Are we recognizing how this historical and cultural trauma may be compounding the trauma of a sexual assault? Ultimately, by maintaining a trauma-informed approach and utilizing these 6 principles or guidelines, we are able to better respond to the needs of survivors and prevent a re-traumatizing environment. Next slide. All right, so for the next couple of slides, we're going to go into what the crisis intervention process looks like. So this slide mainly talks about what the survivor should be taking away from the crisis intervention process. So these are things you're helping them build as they go through this process with you. So during crisis intervention, one of the most important things to do as an advocate is to actively listen.
Oh,
I think
okay.
someone's off mute. So one of the most important things that you can do is actively listen. So you're listening to not only what the survivor is telling you, but it's also how they're telling you. What is their body language telling you? What is their tone of voice telling you? So in those things, you're helping them identify what the crisis is, what is going on, what brought them to you, what brought them to this hotline call or to the hospital or to the courtroom or this interaction with you, what is going on and what led up to this. The survivor should also be able to understand the available resources that they have for them. So this would be community referrals that are available to them. This could be other resources that your agency provides, and they should be able to understand how to access them. Survivors should feel empowered to make informed decisions. So again, you're not making the decisions for them, but you're laying out all of the options of here are all of the resources available to you. Here are some options of things that you can do. And then you let them lead the situation and decide what resources they want. Survivors should also be able to believe in themselves. And this is done by the advocate providing that supportive environment, again, creating that safe physical and emotional space for them. Next slide. So this slide is about how you as the advocate are able to help the survivor accomplish the things on the previous slide that we just talked about. So you're establishing rapport with the survivor. Oftentimes, it's an uncomfortable situation when the survivor comes to you, maybe the first time that you're meeting them. So how are you building that trust with the survivor? How are you showing them that this is a safe place? You are a comfortable person to be with. This is someone that you are someone that you can trust. You're also helping to assess the situation. So paying attention again to that language that they're using, that tone of voice they're using, their body language. You also want to assess whether the situation is acute. This means that the crisis just happened. So they may be in immediate danger. You need to assess, okay, are you safe right now? Is the person causing harm still around? Or this is a non-acute situation. So maybe the crisis happened a while ago, but something happened that made them be back into a state of overwhelm, or they're not able to cope by their normal means of coping or their normal problem-solving devices. So assessing the safety in that situation looks a little bit different than if it was an acute situation. But nevertheless, safety is of the utmost importance. So assessing the safety of the situation, assessing what's going on, and then intervening, providing resources and planning. So this is the core part of crisis intervention, where you're assessing the situation, but you're providing the resources that match whatever the situation is. You're laying out all of the options and you're giving that power back to the survivor to decide which options they want to go with or what resources that they need. And lastly, we have closure for the survivor. So this is really important. It's often forgotten about, but it's really important to provide provide opportunity for any last questions that the survivor may have at the close of your services. If there's any information that you need from them, such as contact information, so you can put that into the agency database, explaining to them that that's what you're doing, making sure that they understand confidentiality. If there's any last information they need on reaching out to the referral sources that you've given them or community resources or how to access other community resources, making sure that they know whatever the next steps are in their plan if they've created one with you, and providing them with this opportunity that if they ever need to come and reach back out to you, that they can, and making sure that you're providing that information to them. Next slide. All right, so we've talked about crisis intervention and the crisis intervention process and what a crisis is, and providing the importance of providing resources to survivors. So my first question, and you can go ahead and put your answers in the chat. If you feel comfortable, you can come off mute if you want, or you can put your answers in the chat. But the first question is, what type of information may a survivor in crisis need? And I can put this question in the chat as well, if that helps. So what type of information may a survivor in crisis need? Yep. So how to get an assault kit, resources. So what kind of resources do we think they may need? Shelter information, social services, transportation, emergency contraception, safe places to stay, housing and relocation, counseling, immediate housing, a safe place to go. Yep, so these are all really great ones. Let's see, location of safe places, resources for trauma-related therapy services, a safety plan, support groups, legal services, yep. Cash assistance, laws around reporting and statute of limitations, medical services, emotional support, behavioral health counseling, mental health resources, legal and safety, someone to listen to their needs, criminal and civil options, and mental health. Yeah, these are all really great. So yeah. Any other comments? Go ahead and put those in the chat. My next question is, what community referrals may survivors in crisis need, or where may you refer survivors in crisis? Looks like we have translation services also as a resource. So what community referrals may survivors in crisis need? Healthcare, mental health programs, shelter, a crisis center, local social services, churches, shelter, MCASA, mobile crisis team, programs like SHARP, social services, food, family, counseling, hospital, rental assistance, courts, mental health providers. Yep, definitely. Maybe also some places where they can receive financial resources, a forensic exam. Yep. Possibly other victim advocacy organizations. MCASA's Sexual Assault Legal Institute is also a great resource. More on that later. The DoD and community resources. Yeah, so these are all really great. Thank you so much, everyone who participated. I see another one here. Referrals for clothing and food, etc. Definitely. So keep it coming. But I'm going to hand it back over to Steph for her to pick up presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Alyssa. And thank you all for putting those comments in the chat. One of the things that is probably one of my favorite parts of our sexual assault victim advocate training is we have folks from all over Maryland and some folks that serve outside of Maryland, that serve survivors outside of Maryland. So you are all bringing your experience to this training as well, and we want to learn from each other. So throughout the next 2 weeks, you'll hear us say that. So please feel free to drop things in the chat or come off mute, because we have 115 people on the call today. We're adding in someone right now, so maybe 116. So this is a lot of knowledge that we have as a group. So thank you for sharing that in this first exercise, and please share that so we can learn from each other throughout the rest of the exercises. So Alyssa did a great job of laying the foundation of crisis intervention. And though we really talk about it as a group of 6 principles, guidelines, because we know every situation is different, we do have some pretty hard do's and don'ts when it comes to crisis intervention. Some of you that have been doing this for a while, these are going to sound like a repeat. But for those of you that are new, these are some things that you need to consider in your work using those 6 principles of crisis intervention. So the do's are providing empathetic support, active listening, so asking open-ended and grounding questions, paraphrasing and asking questions for clarity. This can be particularly important if you're doing intervention over the phone. And you will learn more about the neurobiology of trauma as we go throughout this training. But one of the things that happens when someone has experienced trauma or is in crisis is it's very hard for their brain to put together the story in a timeline and using words that someone else might understand. So you may have to ask some questions and paraphrase some of what they've told you so that you're understanding it well. You don't have to ask them a lot of questions, though. This is for your understanding, not for investigation. So keep that in mind. Be comfortable with silence. Sometimes the survivor you're working with might just need a minute. It's fine for things to be quiet. Assess for safety and practice cultural humility. Recognize the client's strength, independence, and ability to make their own decisions. You will hear us say this a lot in the next 2 weeks. We, as advocates, empower survivors. So that's an absolute do during the crisis intervention process. And Alyssa talked about this a little bit, but I want to go into a little bit more clarity. You want to close the session or close the phone call or close the experience with this survivor. And if you don't think about that ahead of time, it can be awkward or confusing. Or have you ever been on the phone with someone not in crisis or had lunch with someone and you have to like say goodbye and it kind of feels weird? We don't want that to happen with our crisis intervention. So think about how you close the session with them. You can define next steps. You can go over an action plan if there is one, and provide appropriate resources based on the victim's or survivor's decision. And we'll talk about that a little bit more, but this just gets us started on how do you end a crisis intervention session with someone. Sometimes those sessions are really small, they're not very long. You give the survivor what they need, they're able to get calmed down and move on to their next step. Sometimes they can be a little emotionally draining and emotionally labor intensive. So you want to be able to close that session out. We also have some don'ts when it comes to crisis intervention. So you don't want to ask victim blaming questions. These questions are usually like who, what, where, why, particularly why. And when some of that information you don't need to know. So if you are asking a question, make sure it's information you need to know as an advocate before you ask it. And make sure that those questions are open-ended and not victim blaming. So examples of victim blaming questions might be things like that they could answer yes or no to, like, did you eat before you went out? What were you wearing? Or were you wearing something, insert a description? Those that's not information you need to know. That might be something a police officer would ask in an investigation, or a nurse in a hospital situation might ask about clothes because she might need to use something on the clothes for evidence. But as an advocate, you probably don't need to be asking that. So think about those questions and make sure they are not sending a message of victim blaming. And disclose your personal information as much as possible, given the circumstances. You don't want to talk too much about yourself. And they may ask you questions about yourself. Have you ever been sexually assaulted? Are you a survivor of sexual assault? As an advocate, you're not obligated to answer those questions. And I would encourage you to refer to your own organization's policies on those kinds of disclosures. This is not the time to diagnose. Crisis center, even if you are of a profession that provides diagnoses in physical or mental health, advocacy is not the time to do that. Tell the survivor that you understand their situation. This can be a very hard one because part of the role of an advocate is normalizing the fact that a lot of people get sexually assaulted, normalizing that it's scary and confusing and upsetting and those types of things. But we also don't want to tell the survivor in the context of trying to normalize that the survivor, that we understand their situation. Because even if we had something similar to happen to us, even if we've been an advocate for a decade and we've seen this before, that to the survivor can really shut down their conversation with you in trying to get through the crisis intervention. Ask questions that are off topic. Or lead the survivor or ask why questions. So leading the survivor would be kind of asking them a question and giving them a yes or no option. So kind of giving them the answer in the question and just giving them the option to say yes or no. So you don't want to lead them along in the questions. You want to leave those open-ended and not victim blaming. And you almost never need to ask a why question. So before the word why comes out of your mouth, think about it really carefully. You don't want to focus too much on reporting. It's not a requirement of sexual assault survivors to report in order to get most of the services that they would need. So don't focus too much on that. You don't want to take the survivor's reactions too personally. They may be very angry, they may be very upset, they may not want to talk, they may feel very uncomfortable. None of that is your fault. But you may be the person in the room with them when they're experiencing all of this. So try not to take those too seriously. And this is the one that I think I personally struggled with the most when I was doing work with sexual assault survivors. You don't want to overwhelm the survivor with unnecessary information. So you have a lot of information that can help that survivor, but we want to give that information in a way that the survivor can really understand, digest, and learn about it in a way that helps empower them to make the best decision for them. It's easy as advocates in a crisis situation to just want to flood them with information, but flooding them with information can be confusing and disorienting. So we want to make sure that we are not overwhelming them. So we like to hop right in to tips for managing difficult situations. So if you have never worked with a sexual assault survivor before, you probably, the scenarios you've created in your head about how hard it's going to be are probably never going to happen. It's probably never going to be that difficult. But there are situations in crisis intervention that are difficult. And so we want to talk about that so you have a way to prepare this in your own mind as you are working with crisis intervention. So much of what makes a situation difficult is normal trauma response. Anger, confusion, crying, numbness. This is all normal for someone in a crisis situation. And so the first thing we want to do is evaluate the situation. What is making this intervention difficult? Is it something going on the survivor's end? They don't want to talk, they're crying, they're distracted, they're intoxicated. Is that what is making this difficult? Is it something on your end? Are you distracted? Are you triggered? Is it something that both of you are experiencing that make it difficult? Maybe if you're on the phone, it's a bad connection and you can't hear well. Maybe you're both distracted by something. Maybe you're not in a safe place to talk or a private place that feels safe for the survivor. Any of those things can be making a situation difficult. And so once you've kind of figured out what is making it difficult, you want to work with the survivor together to solve the problem. So I'll give you a simple example. Maybe you're on the phone with the survivor and you are distracted, or you think they are distracted by the television in the background. You can always work with them to see if they can move to a place where the TV is not in the same room, ask them to turn it down, see if they can hear you okay, and kind of talk about how to change that situation. You want to validate what's happening and the emotions around it and how difficult it might be for that survivor to seek your resources, to call your hotline, to show up at your office and make appointment, to come to the hospital. So acknowledge their difficulty and the bravery and them seeking help in the first place. This is particularly helpful with survivors that aren't talking or might be crying. So talking to them about how brave they are and how difficult this situation is. You want to assess their immediate resources. So do they have access right now to someone that can support them, especially if you're not in the same location as them? Is there something else that might give them comfort? A family member, a pet? Do they need a break? Like assess what they have available to them right now if the situation is difficult. You want to provide resources if that's appropriate. You don't need to know a survivor's entire story to tell them what your agency does. You don't need to know if it was sexual assault or domestic violence to just go over the basics of what you do. And that may trigger them to be able to talk about what happened or ask questions about that resource and line it up with their experience to see if that's something that serves them. You continually, and you will hear us talk about this a lot, you continually want to reassess their safety. So if the conversation's going well and then it gets difficult, you may want to ask some of those safety questions. and kind of make sure that they are still in a safe location. You want to invite the survivor to take time to reflect, make decisions, or rest. This can be very helpful to kind of sometimes even give them permission to do these things. They don't need your permission to take time and reflect, but sometimes just hearing someone say it can be helpful for them to decide what's best for them. The only thing one of the things, I guess, that's very time sensitive when it comes to sexual assault is a sexual assault forensic exam. So you will learn more about those in future sessions. I think the session might even be tomorrow. And so you will want to provide a survivor with a little bit of information on how and why they may want to go get one of those exams sooner rather than later to preserve evidence and to make sure that they're physically healthy. The point of those exams is medical attention first and then evidence collection if that's something the survivor wants to do. So that is something that's time sensitive, but most of the stuff is not. So you can give them that time to reflect and make the decision that's best for them. You can ask grounding questions if that's appropriate. And if necessary, move towards ending the interaction or the phone call with that survivor. So consult your organization on your own protocols there, and what it might be to do that. And whenever you're ending an interaction or a call, if your agency is a 24-hour agency or they're open for survivors, make sure they know that and invite them to contact you again. I served on a hotline for I think 5 or 6 years. And every time I ended a call, I always invited the person to call back, even if they weren't in crisis. I was like, we're here. This is a 24-hour line. We're here to help you. It might not be me, but someone will answer this phone. And I think that gave people a little bit of relief to know that they could get a hold of us at any time. So when dealing with a difficult situation, you want to focus on empowerment and empowering that survivor to make the best decision for themselves. And don't forget that for the most part, many situations, that person called you, or that person came to your office, or that person came to the hospital for help. So they were seeking help. So they want to also be part of this process for getting through this crisis. So let's talk a little bit about grounding. I want to take a little bit of time to talk about some of these techniques. Grounding techniques are not new, but we have seen a lot more people talking about them, and we've learned about them a little bit more in since the pandemic. People talked a lot about grounding. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that relates to sexual assault. And to simply define it, grounding is bringing yourself or someone else into the present moment through physical and mental stimuli. So that's like the official definition, but we're going to break it down. There are many, many ways to ground yourself or to help someone else to be grounded. But I want to start by saying, when it comes to grounding during a crisis, don't be fancy. Use simple, easy to relate to, and understandable techniques. So if you are a pranayama expert, or you love alternate nostril breathing, or Kundalini yoga, I get it. I love those things too. But crisis is not the time for that. And if you don't know any of those words I just said or what they mean, don't worry, because simple grounding is not that hard. And you're probably already doing some of these things. So before we get into some specifics regarding grounding, I also want to say that grounding will not work if that's not what the survivor needs. So address the problem they're having in that moment, and don't use grounding to distract or something just to keep yourself as an advocate busy or feeling useful. So for example, you can't ground someone who isn't in a safe place. They first need to get safe. This is a good point to talk about the difference between real and perceived physical threat. So an example being, if someone is in a home with an unsafe person, this is a real physical threat, and they could be in immediate physical danger. So now is not the time for grounding. However, if they're in a courtroom with this person that harmed them, their brain is going to register that the same amount of danger as when they were in the house by themselves with them. But that person is unlikely to be able to physically attack them in the courtroom. Emotionally and mentally, yes, they can and they probably will. But this might be a good time for grounding because it brings them back into that present reality, knowing that this person can't hurt them in this courtroom or can't physically hurt them in this courtroom. So those are some ways to think about what situations might require grounding or grounding might be helpful. So let's talk specifically about some ways to help ground a survivor. And these techniques also can help ground you in stressful situations. So let's talk about breathing techniques. This is probably the simple and fastest way to ground someone. Just focus on your inhale and your exhale. Taking deep breaths and focusing on those inhales and exhales can begin to calm your central nervous system. You don't have to tell your nervous system to calm down, it just will if you are doing some deep breathing. It's helpful to have your inhales and exhales the same length, or to have your exhales a few beats longer than your inhales, just a physiological response. Similar to what we did at the beginning of our workshop. It can help if you count. Pick whatever number might be helpful for you or the survivor. 3, 4, 8. The trick is to concentrate on the breath and to try to make it even. I have 2 pro tips here. 1, don't tell someone to calm down and take deep breaths. Invite them to take deep breaths with you. And it's helpful if they can sense your breathing through another one of their 5 senses. If they can see you breathing and physically moving, that's helpful. If you're on the phone, they might be able to hear you breathing. That's also helpful. The last tip, this is kind of a bonus tip of those 2, is sometimes it can help, and I don't know the physiological reason for this, but sometimes it can help to pretend you're exhaling through a straw. Something about that movement in your face and your lungs and the way the air exhales that can help someone calm down a little bit. So breathing is simple, it's easy, everyone knows how to do it. So if you need a quick grounding activity, this could really be helpful. The next one I want to talk about is physical grounding. And this is about connecting with your body. This is the grounding you most often see on TV and in movies. So when an actor goes into a bathroom and splashes water on their face, or if anyone has seen Die Hard, or I think Zac Efron has a documentary series about travel, they both do these things where they take off their shoes and they walk around in the ground or they squish their feet in the carpet. This is physical grounding. So this is often seen in movies and TV during stressful situations. You can ask them to put their feet on the floor and feel the floor support them or a chair support them. They're lying down for whatever reason, and you know this. So this could be in a hospital. They could feel the bed support them. Really start to feel start to talk about what their body's feeling. You can ask them to observe and describe the space they're in. That can be helpful if you aren't in the same space as them, like on the phone. You can see if they can hold something that brings them comfort, like a pillow or a blanket, a stuffed animal. Ask if they need a drink. This takes them out of their head and into their physical body. Like, do I need a drink? If I want a drink, what do I want? Hot, cold, ice? This can be really helpful. Running warm or cold water over their hands or face, or moving, stretching, standing up, sitting, walking, if they're in a safe place to do that. All of those things can bring them back into their physical body. The last one I want to talk about is mental grounding. And this is bringing your thoughts back into the present moment. Our brains are amazing. They can be very creative and they do a lot of amazing things to protect us. You will learn about the neurobiology of trauma in a few days and the amazing ways our brains react to trauma. These same parts of our brains designed to keep us safe can also pull us out of the present moment. So sometimes you'll hear this referred to as post-traumatic stress syndrome, being triggered, or uncontrollable doom spiraling. These mental grounding techniques can be used to bring our brains back into ourselves, back into the present moment for that sexual assault survivor. So a couple of ways to do mental grounding. You can have a safe statement, or sometimes called a mantra. So having someone repeat out loud or to themselves, I am safe, I'm okay now, no one can hurt me. It's great if the survivor can come up with their own safety statement or mantra, but those are a couple of examples to get you started. If you have a safety statement or mantra, if you want to share that in the chat, if you know something that's worked for you or survivor and you feel comfortable sharing that, please do. Just to give us a pool of ideas. They can say the alphabet forwards or backwards. If you've ever had surgery, the anesthesiologist who is there to put you into your sleep, they'll sometimes ask you to do this. This is not medical. This is just helping you kind of relax and get into a state where your mind is in that present moment. Reciting a favorite poem, scripture or prayer, all of those things can help with mental grounding. The double one here is singing. So singing can help with mental grounding and breathing. So if someone is a singer and they want to hum a tune or sing a tune, that can really help with grounding too. So this is just a quick lesson and some review of grounding. I encourage you to practice on yourself the next time you are experiencing stress, standing in a line, waiting in a doctor's office, something that is generally unpleasant. Try some of this grounding and see how it works for you. That will help you be able to kind of explain it and talk through it with a survivor if in a crisis situation if you need to. So let's talk a little bit about closure for advocates. So we've talked about the process. We've talked about some of the steps to take if it's difficult. We talked about grounding. Let's talk about how you need to, as an advocate, take care of yourself after a situation. So take time to evaluate your own feelings after a crisis. Do you feel stressed? Do you feel exhausted? Do you feel proud? Are you sad? What are you feeling? What are you feeling in your heart? What are you feeling in your mind? What are you feeling in your body? Also take time to appreciate yourself for what you were able to offer in this situation. And if you are experiencing strong feelings of judgment towards yourself and how you handled the situation, if you want to think about those and even jot down a note or two about how you might handle it differently, some skills you want to build, some information you want to have on hand, that's fine. But put a time limit on that. Don't spend the next hour or day or week thinking about that. Give yourself 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and then put it to bed. And then give yourself some self-care. So do some self-care exercises for yourself. We'll talk a lot about self-care in one of our upcoming sessions, but the caveat I want to put on this self-care is sometimes what you do for self-care is not available to you after a crisis situation. So if your self-care, for example, is to take a walk around your neighborhood or around your block, if you're dealing with a crisis intervention at 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, that walking around the block might not be available to you. You might be exhausted. It might be available to you, but it's exhausting. So that's not going to work this time. So think about some specific things you can do to take care of yourself after a crisis situation. I'll give you an example of one of mine. When I did hospital advocacy, It's often a long process. So it can be 3, 4, 5, sometimes more hours. And the survivor cannot sometimes drink during that process because they don't want to compromise evidence. So as an advocate, I did not want to drink in front of the survivor. And so the first thing I would do when I got home from a hospital crisis intervention is I would have a big glass of water. I would almost always take a shower. Even if I didn't need it, it just felt like a reset for me. If even if it wasn't during my normal, shower routine, it just felt good to get in, get kind of the hospital washed off of me, so to speak. So those were things that were my specific self-care for crisis intervention. So think about that and how you might react to crisis intervention, self-care after the situation is over. So we're going to move on to 3 very specific kinds of advocacy and some tips for each one of those. So the first one I want to talk about is I want to talk a little bit about hotline advocacy. So if you are a volunteer or an employee that's managing a crisis line, you are working with survivors mostly over the phone, maybe through text, maybe through a video call. These are kind of the list of things that are going to kind of happen, maybe not in this order, in this kind of advocacy. You want to assess safety, especially since you may not be able to see or be in the same spot as that person. You're just going to listen to the survivor's story. Why are they calling you? Why are they, video chatting you or texting you? You're going to provide resources. So what does your agency do that they might be calling about? And you're going to answer questions. You're going to review that information before you end that call. So for example, if they are interested in your counseling services and you've answered some questions about that, you may want to review that information at the end of the call so that they have gotten multiple points of information about that service. Like I said a couple slides ago, invite the survivor to call back, to video back, to chat back with you, or the other people that work on that helpline. I think that really opens up the continued relationship this survivor is going to have with your agency. And you want to empower the survivor with information without overwhelming them. If somebody was sexually assaulted a year ago, 2 years ago, maybe as a child, you don't want to overwhelm them with information about a sexual assault response exam. That's not going to be an option for them. They may have questions, and absolutely you would want to answer those, but you want to make sure that your information is empowering and not overwhelming. If you are going to do hospital advocacy or in-person advocacy, this might not be at a hospital, but at an in-person kind of facility where a survivor might be going to seek services. This kind of advocacy is working with survivors during a sexual assault response exam or emergency room visit. So you want to maintain the focus on the survivor's needs. Often, folks involved with the sexual assault forensic exam or emergency room visit are doing other things. You are the only person that's there just for the survivor. You're not there to investigate. You're not there to offer opinions to law enforcement or hospital staff. You're not doing any kind of medical intervention or exam. It's not to say that these other folks aren't concerned with the survivor's well-being or aren't working through their own trauma-informed lens, but their jobs are different than theirs. Your job is to be there for the survivor. And they might be really helpful in that process, which is great, but your focus is that survivor. They may be focused on the survivor, but they also have another role to play in a sexual assault forensic exam. So you want to provide information and answer questions about what's happening in the exam or the emergency room. The forensic nurse examiner is a great resource for providing specific information on medical procedures and medication. So if you don't know the answer, or if you think the forensic nurse can answer it better, you're going to tell the survivor that, and they are exceptionally trained and ready to answer those questions. They are also there to assist the survivor first medically and then to collect evidence if that's what the survivor wants. And I will say, as a tip, once the forensic nurse examiner is on scene, they kind of direct what happens during the exam. You're there for the survivor. The nurse kind of is often the head of that process, or they should be taking over that exam process and directing it. So you want to assist with any immediate needs, such as transportation, shelter, referrals to other services. They may need clothing. What does your organization provide, and where can you refer them? Those are the things you want to know before going into that situation. And when I say you are the one there that's focused on the survivor, this is your role to help them after the exam, if they need transportation, if they need shelter, if they need referrals. So you want to ensure that the survivor is not billed for the sexual assault forensic exam. Most of this time, this takes place after the hospital visit. So you want to make sure you understand your organization's resources as they relate to that, and how the survivor needs to contact you if they are having trouble with that billing. They are not supposed to. Hospitals are supposed to know how to do this. And my experience, and the experience I hear from the field a lot, is that is mostly true. But every once in a while, something will slip through and a survivor will get billed. It happens very rarely, but it's a big deal when it happens. So you want to make sure you can help them with that process. You want to address other injuries or safety concerns the survivor might have. So you might end up doing some safety planning as part of this advocacy, and working with that survivor on what is helpful for them once they leave the exam as well. And you want to develop a plan for follow-up with the survivor. There may be specific protocols from your agency, so make sure that you're talking to your organization about what the expectations are for the follow-up plan for a survivor. When I did hospital advocacy, our follow-up was 24 to 36 hours after the exam, and that depended on when the exam ended. We wanted to follow up with them within 24 hours, but if the exam ended at 2 a.m. in the morning, sometimes we would say, we'll follow up in a day or a day and a half, because we wanted them also to get the rest they needed. It also was not the person in the hospital with them. That advocate was not usually doing the follow-up. So I would say at the end of the crisis intervention in the hospital, someone from this agency is going to follow up. It's not going to be me. It'll be someone trained in counseling. So be expecting a call from them. Here is our number. If you need anything beforehand, give us a call. So we had a lot of guidance in my agency on what to do. If you don't have that guidance, talk to your supervisors, talk to the folks you're volunteering for about what the expectations are, and if you can get some clear answers on that. The other thing I will say, and I will try to drop it in the chat at some point, or better yet, I'll probably send it in the email. If you are doing hospital advocacy, MCASA this past fall did a great webinar on really specific information and techniques for doing hospital advocacy. So it was kind of like a second part of this one slide. So Grace Rupp, one of our sexual assault response team specialists, she also works with our prison rape elimination program, provided this training for us. So I'll make sure that you get the link for that hospital-based advocacy program. And I highly recommend reviewing it. It's not part of this session, but if you are doing hospital advocacy, or if you are assigned that as one of your volunteer or job opportunities in the future, it's a really great in-depth look at what hospital advocacy entails. So the last one I want to talk about is legal advocacy. And legal advocacy is interesting because the other two are very short term. One 10-minute phone call, one 4 or 5 hour crisis intervention in a hospital. Legal advocacy can go on for months or sometimes even years. So this advocacy has a little bit of a different twist to it than the other two. So to define it, legal advocacy is working with survivors to educate them on their legal options and help them navigate the legal process. And by options, you are not, as an advocate, a lawyer. If you are acting as an advocate and not a lawyer, you're still, wanting to stay within the lane of what advocates are doing. So you are not engaging in the unauthorized practice of law. You're not giving them legal advice. You're just helping them through this process, oftentimes with an attorney. So you're providing emotional support and safety planning throughout the legal process that they might be engaged in. You may assist in both civil and criminal court. You'll meet throughout this training some of our Sexual Assault Legal Institute advocates and attorneys, and they'll talk to you about what that looks like a little bit closer. You may attend hearings and court proceedings to support the survivor through those. You may explain legal terms and support the survivor through steps of the legal process. You may provide survivors with information and referrals so that they can make the best choice for themselves. It's important as a legal advocate for you to know the history of the justice system's bias and its impact on survivors. So that may help you understand why they may or may not want to engage in the legal system, or why they may start to engage and then decide they don't want to. Or they may decide they want to engage with the legal system like in a large amount of time after the assault may have occurred. So I'll give you an example. When I did legal advocacy, this is the advocacy I worked the least in, but I did do some legal advocacy in my direct service work. And one of the most important things I did as a legal advocate was explain how to get to the courthouse and what it was going to be like in the courthouse. And this seems very like maybe unimportant even in the process of legal advocacy. But they had a lawyer that was explaining all the legal stuff to them, but the lawyer didn't tell them where to park, or the lawyer didn't meet them out front and make sure they knew they were going through a metal detector. Um, and the lawyer didn't tell them how to get to their office very specifically. So my job, one of the important things in my job was making sure I met them out in front of the courthouse. They didn't have to think about where to go. I would just guide them on my way there to the attorney's office. Um, and they knew they had to go through a metal detector. I would also give them advice on what to expect. I worked with college students, so I'd say, don't bring your laptop because you won't be able to use it, but bring your notes or a book or something to read, a magazine to look at. We could be there for a really long time waiting. And so they weren't just sitting there with nothing to do. They were prepared for the fact that this might be a while and they might need something to distract or comfort them in that time. So this is, it seems really simple, but they all expressed to me, the ones that I worked with, that was really helpful, particularly knowing that they would have to go through a metal detector, which I did not expect. I just told a survivor the first time I did it offhand, like, hey, make sure you're careful what you pack because we're going to have to run it through a scanner, like at the airport. And they almost didn't go. And I was like, it's just a scanner. I'll be there for you. They're not going to touch you. They're not going to pat you down. They may run a wand around you, like if you're wearing a belt or something like that. And then they once they knew I was going to be there with them, then they agreed to go and continue with the process. But that's kind of one of the important things to think about when you're thinking about legal advocacy is we may know this stuff very, very well because we're going to the courthouse often, or we've been there, or we have colleagues that are lawyers. But as survivor, it's not their job to know this stuff. It's our job to support them through that. One of the things that our legal advocates at the Sexual Assault Legal Institute do is we collect various things to put in a little backpack for students that have to go to court or kids that have to go to court. So if they have to go to court to testify, they get this little backpack with comforting things in it, with sometimes we put a little candy in there. We put notebooks, coloring books, stickers, things to bring them comfort and keep them occupied during what can be a very long, stressful process in the courthouse. So those are some ways to look at legal advocacy, providing emotional support and safety. And what does that mean for your advocacy, your courthouse, and how things work in your county or with your agency? So now that we have talked about all of these different aspects of advocacy, I know it's day one, but I also know some of you have really had some great experience in this already. So we're going to go through a couple scenarios to end our presentation today, and we invite you to either come off mute or drop in the chat your answers to these. So the first scenario involves in-person advocacy. So you are working on an on-call victim advocate hotline, and you receive a call from a local hospital that a survivor is requesting an advocate during a sexual assault forensic exam. When you arrive at the hospital, the survivor is clearly distraught and very anxious about the exam. As the exam proceeds, you see that Jane, the survivor, is visibly uncomfortable as more invasive swabbing begins. She stops the forensic nurse and asks if she can have a few minutes to speak with you, as she does not want to continue the exam, but worries that if she does not complete the exam, she may not have enough evidence to start a case against her perpetrator. So the question here is, how would you, along with support from the forensic nurse, offer her support during this scenario? What options are available to her during this forensic exam? So here we are, day one. We talked a little bit about this. What are some of your ideas of how you might handle this situation? I'm going to open the chat box up. Oh, Alyssa already put in there the hospital-based advocacy. Thank you, Alyssa. Great. Okay, so we hear someone giving her space to breathe. Absolutely. That might be all she needs. Um, Hannah wrote, I would first hear her out, ask what sort of thoughts or feelings are coming up for her and validate them. 100% Hannah. Know that it's hard. Know that this is really a challenging situation. Reassure Jane that you won't leave her. Great answer, Amber. Thank you. Titus, remind her that she can take a break at any point in the exam if she becomes overwhelmed. Absolutely. There are also, you'll learn a little bit more about this. And if you do hospital advocacy, you'll learn about this. A survivor can deny part of an exam if they don't want it. Like if it's too much, they can deny that. And I'll give you kind of an example. They used to pull like 10 hairs out of the head of survivors. They don't do that anymore, but they used to do that. And you can understand why that's not really useful. They did it for DNA testing. And then they were like, if we actually need those hairs, we know where to find them. Like this isn't immediate. Like we don't need this at the minute of the exam. So they take their DNA a different way. But if a survivor didn't want the hairs pulled out of their head, they could say that and they wouldn't do it. So there are parts that they can also say that they don't want to participate in. Um, Ask if they need time to their self. Absolutely. Great. These are great answers. Validate and listen to her. One of the things you can work with the nurse on is, like I said earlier, sometimes they don't want them to drink anything because they don't want to compromise any evidence that they might be able to take from certain parts of their body. So drinking and going to the bathroom, if it's appropriate, the nurse may not want them to do that. But you may be like, hey, do you want to drink? We'll have the nurse do those parts of the exam first. Or is she cleared to have a drink of water or to have some juice or something like that that might calm them down? I used to take a bag of quarters into the hospital with me. So when we were done with the exam, there was this huge bank of vending machines on the way out. And I was like, I would just hand them a pile of quarters. I was like, what do you want? Like, are you hungry? Are you thirsty? Sometimes they would be like, no, I can't eat. I'm not ready. And sometimes they would spend $10 in quarters at the vending machine because that was where they were, which was totally great. Like I wanted them to have the option to do that if that would bring them comfort and some healing in that moment after we kind of finished the actual exam. So all those things are doing. Oh, I love this one from Rosita asking if they're cold. My gosh, I'm always cold. I love that question. And do you know hospitals have like blanket warmers? So like, can you bring her a warm blanket? That might be all that they would need. I love that one. Great. These are super answers. Thank you all who are sharing. Fantastic. We have two more scenarios, so I'm gonna move on to the next one and turn it over to Alyssa for that one.
Thank you. So for this one, so you receive a call from a survivor, John, who identifies as a cisgender gay man. John is calling because he has been experiencing harassment from his roommate, who identifies as female. John tells you that his roommate recently assaulted him. He tells you that his roommate has always made remarks about how she wishes John was straight because she was so attracted to him. And one night, as John is walking to his bedroom after a shower, his roommate grabs his towel off and gropes him. John calls the hotline because he is unsure of his options. What support would you offer John, and what specific resources might he require?
So while we're waiting for some of those answers, I will also say one of the things that you want to do before you even get to this call from John is to make sure that your services, your website, your advertising, where you're going to do outreach also include the LGBT community. You want to make sure that John knows before he even picks up that phone that if he calls you, your agency is going to be affirming and ready to help him as a gay man. I think some agencies have done a brilliant job at this. Some of you may have a ways to go, which is fine as well. Now that we've kind of talked about some of this in this scenario, or as we talk about some of this, think about how your agency, what you need to do before you even get the phone call, and how your advocates, yourself and advocates that you work with need to be ready.
All right, so we've got some responses. So asking if he's in a safe place right now, assessing safety, listening to the story, providing resources, asking whether he feels safe or if there's a friend or a family member that he feels safe with that he can go to for temporary shelter, directing him to the hotlines and all resources available for him, reassuring him that it's not his fault, that he deserves respect and autonomy, that says, I will give you information to GLAAD as well as other resources that will help cultivate safe spaces for you. Let him know that we're there to support him, do a check-in, listen to his concerns and how he's feeling, ensuring he's safe and has a safe place to stay until he decides his next steps, offer a forensic exam, maybe counseling. Safety planning, if there's a safe place he can go, housing resources, asking what he feels he most needs right now, asking if he wants counseling services. Yeah, these are all really great. And definitely if your agency is unable to provide a resource that he may need, I like this one where providing resources that other agencies have. You don't have to be the one that has everything that everyone could possibly need. There are other resources out there, other agencies that may be specialists in something that you aren't. So having those partnerships with those agencies, having those connections with them, and then sharing those resources and connections with the survivors is going to be a huge help. Definitely. Housing resources is another one. Yep. Yeah, these are all really great.
Yeah, these are super. I would add to housing resources too, possibly financial resources. If he's looking at moving or one of those options, if you have that resource available. These are excellent, excellent. I would say I like the folks that were talking about validating his situation. One of the things I did most as a hotline advocate in the 6 years that I did that work was validate the feelings and the experience of survivors. Sometimes they just wanted to talk to someone that would say, this is wrong, this is terrible, this was not your fault, and there are people here to help you. So I did a lot of that. So for those of you that are going to work on a hotline or a helpline or a chat line, know that that is a super important part of it. So our last scenario, we're going to talk about circumstances that might relate to virtual advocacy or legal advocacy. Though a lot of court stuff has gone back to, I should say court proceedings instead of court stuff, but um, a lot of those court proceedings have gone back to in person, but there still is prep and pre-hearing stuff and sometimes hearings that are taking place virtually. So this might be a scenario that you would run into. So you're a legal advocate on a Zoom call with a survivor, and you're discussing their upcoming protective order hearing against their former spouse who sexually assaulted them. Now that the courtrooms are open, you will be supporting the client in person during the hearing. But while you're discussing what to expect from the hearing, including having to recall details of past abuse in front of a judge, the survivor begins to hyperventilate and turns off their video. You can hear them crying in the background, but they are no longer speaking and you can no longer see them. How would you show the survivor that you're still present? And what steps would you take to de-escalate the situation or to help them through this crisis? And what additional resources might be available to the survivor? So let me pull up our chat. And while you're answering this question in the chat, I do want to remind you of two different things, I guess. Related to this, you will learn more about the Sexual Assault Legal Institute that we have here at MCASA. You'll get to meet some lawyers and advocates throughout this training. So if you are a little bit puzzled by what to do with legal advocacy or the legal options, you're going to learn about that. So no worries. Also, I want to remind you, Alyssa dropped our evaluation in the chat. She's going to talk about that in a minute, but just know that those evaluations are really important. I'll let her tell you how important, but please also fill that out before we leave today. So talking a little bit, going back to the chat to see what some folks are answering, validate that this is understandably distressing, absolutely. Asking if they're interested in doing a grounding exercise. This may be an absolute appropriate place for a grounding exercise. So thanks for bringing that up, Hannah. Haley also says grounding exercise, breath work, ensuring that they understand you will be there with them throughout the court proceeding. Absolutely. Talk to them about how they're feeling right now, how you can support them. Asking those questions, I think, are really important. And supporting them through that moment, validating their feelings again, trying some deep breathing with them. And I like what Amber says here about being unmuted. If you're doing deep breathing on video, they might be able to see you, when you breathe in, breathe out, they might be able to hear you, which could be really helpful for them to try to get your rhythm and breathe together. I think that's a great one. So this one is about asking the judge if you can say something to the survivor. So in this situation, there isn't actually a judge. It's just you talking to them about what that proceeding will be like. And I would defer to lawyers or the lawyer in the courtroom for what to talk. Like, you don't want to talk to the judge directly. You want to talk to the lawyers about how that process would actually work. And how that when you are in the courtroom with a lawyer and you as an advocate and them, making sure that you know like how to appropriately address all that stuff. Oh, you could ask to be in a private breakout room with the survivor. Like if you're there with a lawyer in this scenario, if there's more than one person, if you want to ask them. The one thing I've seen folks do as well in this situation is to ask if they, and this is not a court room. This is just you doing some pre-meeting work. They'll call them on the phone. So they'll mute the video, they'll mute their sound, and then they'll call them on the phone and they'll talk to the survivor on the phone to try to get them back on video. So I have seen that. I have seen that happen. These are great answers. Well, friends, we are at the end of our presentation. I am going to take I'm going to take down our PowerPoint in just a minute, but are there any questions if people want to come off mute or put any questions in the chat for Alyssa and I at the end of this first session of our sexual assault victim advocate training? I'm going to turn it back over to Alyssa to close. Feel free to put those questions in there. And I look forward to working with you all over the next couple of weeks. I will be here with you next week for a couple of sessions. Alyssa's going to be here with you every day for sessions, helping to facilitate those. So again, welcome to Sexual Assault Victim Advocate Training. And Alyssa, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. All right, so I'd like to now direct everyone's attention to the chat where I posted the evaluation form. As a reminder, if you're seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for CEU credits, you must fill out the evaluation form. Upon submitting the form, you'll see a box with a link in it. If you click on that link, it takes you to the certificate request form. You can expect to receive your certificate within 3 to 4 weeks of completing that request form. I'll be sending out a follow-up email later today with a copy of today's recording, as well as the evaluation link, instructions for finding your certificate, and a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation. If you have any questions, feel free to respond to that email. Thank you again for joining today. We look forward to receiving your feedback on the evaluation. And we hope that you'll join us tomorrow for our presentation on sexual assault response teams and our panel on that as well. Thank you.